Hello, everybody, and welcome to my live on Anhedonia. If anhedonia is not a term you've heard before, it refers to an emotional numbness or emptiness that is often associated with depression. And if you think the idea of emotional numbness sounds nice, it's not. I know that when you're in the midst of a lot of difficult feelings, sometimes you might think to yourself, gosh, I would do anything to just not have to feel my feelings right now. And for a little bit, it can be a nice break. But when you can't feel anything, when you can't feel joy or love or pleasure or achievement, it is not a pleasant experience. It kind of feels like life is on mute and you can't find the remote. Or I've described it often as like an emotional anesthetic, or realistically, if it goes on for a long period of time, what it feels like is a living prison. My goal for this piece of content today is to put out what I hope ends up being the most comprehensive piece of content on anhedonia out there in internet land. Because even though this is a very common symptom and a very horrifying symptom, it is not something that is covered or talked about nearly as much as a lot of the other symptoms of depression for whatever reason. My presentation today is going to be broken down into 4 parts. We're going to talk about what anhedonia is, both emotionally and biologically. We are going to talk about how it is treated from a professional perspective. I'm going to be sharing my personal strategies for overcoming anhedonia, which are different than the kind of more official, so to speak, treatment strategies. And I hope to leave a decent amount of time for questions and answers at the end. I will try not to be too rambly here. Before I get started, I have to give you guys a brief disclaimer. I've been having a weird issue with my microphone where every now and then it changes the pitch of my voice and makes me sound like SpongeBob SquarePants. And I'm not trying to be funny. It has actually been doing that. So I have one request of the chat before we get to Q&A. If I suddenly become SpongeBob, somebody please let me know. All I need to do is unplug and replug back in my microphone. So I'll be vigilant for watching for SpongeBob notifications. Please let me know if anything goes wrong. All right. So anhedonia has a few different subtypes, and they can be defined by the areas of your life that are affected by the anhedonia and the degrees of severity to which it affects those areas. Some people experience what's called social anhedonia. And as the name would imply, social anhedonia is when you experience diminished or completely absent enjoyment or reward from engaging with other people. And so suddenly you don't really care to go out with friends. Spending time with family feels just kind of hollow and empty. You just don't get anything from your interactions with other people. You may still, to some degree, enjoy time to yourself, but your social drive diminishes drastically because the reward or pleasure from interacting with other people is mostly or entirely gone. And to be clear, this is different from introversion. Introverts can still enjoy social experiences. They just find it draining. So when you're experiencing social anhedonia, you are completely unable to enjoy socializing at all. And so obviously you tend to withdraw, you tend to isolate because there is very little to drive you to want to talk to people or be with people. There's also something called physical anhedonia, which refers to more of the physiological experiences of joy. So if you're having physical anhedonia, your food might not taste very good. It can be a lot like if you ever had COVID and lost your sense of taste. There was a false SpongeBob alarm in the chat. You guys are tricky. Your food can be very flavorless or unenjoyable. Your hobbies, your interests. If you're a person like me who, under the right circumstances, enjoys being physically active, going for hikes, things like that, or even being like physical intimacy with your partner, just nothing really feels good to your body. And so your ability to experience like sensory joy can be completely diminished. And then some lucky individuals get what's called total anhedonia, which means you get both. You get the social anhedonia and the physical anhedonia, and essentially nothing in life feels like it has any meaning or purpose. That's the one you really don't want. There are also different degrees of severity of anhedonia. There is partial anhedonia and full anhedonia. I'm not trying to overcomplicate, but partial anhedonia can have within it two subtypes. We can experience a dulled but still present sense of enjoyment. So it kind of feels like when you have dulled anhedonia, it's like you still feel some amount of enjoyment, but it's like someone's turned the volume down a lot. It's there, but it's a shadow of its former self. And there's not a whole lot that you get from doing the things you want to do. There's also something called incomplete anhedonia. This is a really interesting one, but those of you who have experienced it will instantly know what I'm talking about. It's when most, but not all, experiences in a certain category stop being enjoyable to you. So if, for example, you had incomplete social anhedonia, maybe you still enjoy interactions with your partner, but nobody else. There's something about maybe this one person or these two people that still breaks through the anhedonia and you still experience enjoyment under those circumstances, but everything else is gone. Or if it's physical anhedonia, maybe there's one or two foods that you still find some enjoyment out of, but for the most part, nothing. And so our lives often focus on just a few small experiences like over and over and over again. We really get into ruts and just repeat the same behavior because it's essentially the only thing that is breaking through at that point. And then there is full anhedonia, which means it's just completely gone. I mean, literally, you feel nothing. So the absolute worst case scenario would be full total anhedonia, which means no joy or no pleasure from any part of your life whatsoever. One really important thing that I want to mention here, because I see excuse me, I see a few people in the comments mentioning this sounds like me. So anhedonia is a symptom, and in and of itself, it's not a condition. You cannot be diagnosed with anhedonia, but you would experience anhedonia as part of some condition, most likely depression, but there's a few others that we'll talk about today as well. Some people can experience anhedonia for a very, very long time, but I want to make it known that it is not a permanent state of being. Sometimes it lasts for days, sometimes it lasts for weeks, months, it can even be years. But your ability to experience emotion isn't gone when you're in a state of anhedonia. The first time it happened to me, I mean, that's disclaimer if you don't already know. Part of why I have such an interest in this topic is because it's something I've dealt with. And the first time it happened, I was young and like didn't have a lot of these resources that we have now where I could, look up on social media. What the heck does it mean when you feel nothing? And I thought something had permanently changed inside of me. And I was terrified. And I thought, this is just my life now. And it took a very long time for me to get those feelings back, partially because I didn't know what it was and didn't know what the heck I was supposed to do about it. And so I just want to make sure you guys understand that if what I'm describing sounds like something you are currently experiencing, yes, it is terrible. And I will validate that all day long, but do not panic and think this is going to be the rest of your life. Hopefully, the majority of the information I share with you today will help you get a roadmap from where you're at to where you want to be so that we can make some progress on this thing. Now, as far as why people experience anhedonia, this is still, unfortunately, something we don't completely know. And part of the reason for that may be it seems like it is most likely multifactorial, meaning we don't necessarily think that there's one reason for every single person who's ever experienced this. There are likely a few different reasons we can feel this way. The general consensus is that it appears to relate to disruption of the dopamine pathway. So the dopamine pathway is in your brain. Your brain has, I believe it's hundreds of billions of neurons, brain cells. And there are different types of neurons that have different tasks. Many of your neurons are responsible for dopamine transmission. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter or brain chemical that is responsible for producing feelings like joy, excitement, achievement, reward, pleasure. It's basically your happiness chemical. Serotonin's sort of a happiness chemical too, but that one's more about like peace and calm and relaxation. Dopamine's more like life is good and I'm having fun and I want to do more of these things. And so your dopamine pathway is a series of neurons in your brain that when they all fire and chain together creates one of those positive feelings that I just mentioned. It appears that for various reasons, sometimes that pathway can become blocked. I've often explained it as, think of like a bus route in a major city. So if you live on like one side of New York City and you have to get to the other side, you have to take a whole bunch of different buses to get, from your home to your work or whatever it may be. Disruption of the dopamine pathway is like if one of those buses in the middle has caught fire and exploded. You can't get all the way to where you want to be. And in this hypothetical, the destination is not a place, but an emotion. If something has gone wrong along this pathway to pleasure or joy or excitement, you can't get all the way there, or you may not even be able to get started on it. And so your ability to experience those emotions is decreased or gone entirely. There is some evidence that vitamin D deficiency can be a contributing factor for anhedonia. I don't know the detailed research on that one. It's one I've just looked at kind of in passing, but that in and of itself potentially has some treatment implications. If anhedonia is something you have struggled with, it may be worth having your vitamin levels checked or considering vitamins or other supplements. There is also some evidence that suggests that anhedonia is related to hypothyroidism. So if you know that you have an issue with your thyroid, or you suspect that you might have an issue with your thyroid, that could also be worth looking into. Now, diagnostically, I've mentioned that there are several conditions that can cause anhedonia. Most common by far are mood disorders. So mood disorders would include things like major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, persistent depressive disorder, which is what used to be called dysthymic disorder, PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. All of these mood disorders can cause anhedonia. Now, if you have bipolar disorder, you're unlikely to experience anhedonia in a manic episode. You absolutely could experience it during a depressive episode or even a mixed episode. And a brief aside here, mixed episodes with anhedonia, this is only going to apply to a small section of you, is one of the weirdest things you can possibly experience, because you can simultaneously have a tremendous amount of motivation and drive and desperately want to go and do something, but also have nothing you want to do. And it's just the strangest thing. And that's all I'm going to say about that for now. Anhedonia can also be associated with psychotic disorders. So this would be things like schizophrenia, for example. Schizophrenia, or any schizophrenic disorder, any psychotic disorders, we often think of the psychosis, right? Like the auditory and the visual hallucinations and the delusions. And those are the positive, they're called positive symptoms because it's like they add something to your experience, not positive, like they're fun. They're not super fun. But most psychotic disorders also come with what are called negative symptoms. And that can include things like low motivation, flat affect, basically a lot of overlap with depression. And anhedonia is also a negative symptom of many psychotic disorders. Traumatic brain injuries can be associated with anhedonia. If the part of your brain, or the parts of your brain, because it's not literally one part, if any of the parts of your brain that are involved in that dopamine pathway or that are involved in your ability to experience joy become physically damaged by a concussion or something along those lines, that can significantly affect your ability to feel joy and can create sort of a physiological or a neurological anhedonia. It can occur with Parkinson's disease. I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't have a whole lot of insight to add on that, other than if you have Parkinson's disease, you may experience anhedonia. Many substance use disorders can be associated with anhedonia. So what happens with a lot of substances is we experience an increase in emotional intensity or emotional pleasure while we are using the substance. But there then, of course, is a corresponding withdrawal effect, either short-term or long-term. And often during that phase, we feel less enjoyment than our baseline. And if we happen to be a heavy substance user or a regular substance user, sometimes that withdrawal is so extreme that it can put us in a long-term state of anhedonia. So if you're working on sobriety, if you're working on decreasing your use of substances, be prepared to potentially experience some of these symptoms. It is not an official symptom of PTSD like it is with major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, but many individuals with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, do report anhedonia. So that is commonly associated with recovery from trauma as well. As far as treatments, again, I'm going to cover kind of the traditional treatments first, the ones you might go to a therapist or a psychiatrist for. There are two types of psychotherapy, that's just counseling. Like there's like 7 different words for therapy, and they basically all mean the same thing. Cognitive behavioral therapy has pretty strong empirical or research based support for decreasing symptoms of anhedonia. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, as you may have heard it abbreviated, covers a very wide range of treatments. So that can look a lot of different ways. Most commonly in CBT, you're going to be examining how you think and what you believe about yourself, about other people, about the world in general, and looking for what we call cognitive distortions or maladaptive belief systems. Sometimes the way we feel is a result of the way we think. Thoughts and emotions have sort of a cyclical thing going on. They both cause and influence one another. One is not the precursor to the other, but they have sort of a constant interaction effect with one another. And sometimes, for a variety of reasons, usually painful or wounding experiences in life, we develop some maladaptive beliefs as a way of coping with pain and trying to avoid pain in the future. Many of these end up doing more harm than good. I mean, when we walk around with beliefs like nobody loves me, which is supposed to be this so-called protective belief, like, well, if I don't ever think anyone loves me, I'll never get hurt. They actually end up keeping us in this very trapped, dark, numb place. And so a lot of these beliefs that we live with can create or sustain feelings of anhedonia. And cognitive behavioral therapy can be a great way to break some of those down and replace them with healthier, more adaptive beliefs that allow you to experience a little bit more of the world. Behavior activation therapy is the second type of therapy that has pretty strong empirical support for decreasing symptoms of anhedonia. Behavioral activation therapy is more about looking at your daily habits and routines. It's really easy for us to get stuck in ruts in life, especially when we're dealing with depression or really any mental health condition. A lot of times we avoid, we withdraw, we isolate, we pull away from things that are fun. We don't do a lot of things that are good for ourselves. And this too creates essentially a circular problem where we stopped doing these things because we didn't feel good, but now we don't feel good because we stopped doing the things. And it takes us further and further kind of down that spiral. So working with a behavioral activation therapist can help you get out of that and start kind of stacking things in the other direction. There's always this awkward period. I'll talk more about this in my strategies because I have some personal strategies that branch off this. There's always this awkward period where you're doing the things, but you don't feel good about doing the things yet. And that part's really tough, and it can help a lot to have someone supporting you, keeping you accountable, and walking you through that. A second category of professional treatments that can be helpful for anhedonia are, of course, medications. There are 3 classes of psychiatric medications that have shown pretty decent efficacy for anhedonia. And 2 of them are going to be no surprise because they directly treat 2 of the conditions we talked about as being causes of anhedonia. Antidepressants, of course, can help reduce symptoms of anhedonia. I am not a psychiatrist, so I'm going to kind of speed run the med section because other than telling you what they are, I don't really have a whole lot of insight to add on these, but antidepressant medications can absolutely help with anhedonia. Antipsychotics can also help with anhedonia, particularly if the reason you're experiencing anhedonia is because you have a psychotic disorder. And even though anhedonia is not as strongly correlated with anxiety, SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, do also show some benefit there. I know I said I was going to hold questions to the end, but I saw one thing in the chat that I do want to bring up because it correlates with the therapy part. I saw someone mention DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. That is a category of treatments that is kind of considered like early but promising as far as treatment for anhedonia. Some of you may know that DBT was originally designed to treat personality disorders, primarily borderline personality disorder. But frankly, DBT is so awesome that it has turned out to be good for a lot of other things as well. We definitely know that DBT works for depression in general, and excuse me, it appears to have pretty strong treatment effects for anhedonia, but there's just a small sample size issue there. So we're a little ways off from saying like, yes, this is definitely like a legit treatment approach. And then lifestyle modifications can also be helpful. If you look at the functioning of the reward pathway, Sometimes the reason the reward pathway is not functioning properly is because our brains don't physically have the tools they need to produce positive emotions. And unless this is your first time watching me, you probably know what I'm going to say next. But there are 4 pillars of your brain health as far as they relate to your body and your physical health. And those things are sleep hygiene, physical activity, nutrition, and moderating substance use. If you're exhausted, you're probably not going to enjoy your life very much. Your brain, its number one job as an organ, your brain just wants to keep you alive. That's its top priority. And so if it's low on anything, if it's low on any of the resources that it needs to work right, that's the stuff that it's not going to shut off. It's not going to turn off your heart. It's not going to turn off your lungs. What it's going to turn off is your ability to experience positive emotion. Because although that is an important part of life, you can, as many of you guys know, as I myself know, you can live without joy for a long time. It sucks, but it doesn't literally kill you the way like not having sensory inputs or not having a fight or flight response or not having a heartbeat would. And so if you're struggling with sleep, your brain is exhausted. It's not getting the rest it needs, and it's probably not going to prioritize making you feel good and making you feel happy, because that's just not nearly as essential as a lot of the other things it does from a survival perspective. If you are having a hard time getting physical activity in, your brain may not be getting enough blood or oxygen. It needs blood and oxygen to do its job properly. If you've ever looked at any kind of real-time brain imaging technology, like an fMRI, for example, and you've seen like when this person is looking at the Mona Lisa, this certain part of their brain lights up, and then when they're like doing their taxes, this other part of the brain lights up. What's being shown by the lighting up is blood flow. So your brain basically functions on like a power grid, and it diverts resources to the parts of itself that it thinks you need for what you're doing. So when it's low on resources, it prioritizes survival functions. Blood and oxygen are 2 critical resources, and you can maximize blood and oxygen flow to the brain by trying to get some regular physical activity in. It doesn't even have to be every day, but most days. Nutrition is critical here too, because your brain needs caloric energy. Remember that your brain has no ability to store caloric energy. Your brain is just accessing what's in your bloodstream at any given time. And so if you've gone a long period of time without eating, 5-6 hours typically is about your max, assuming you're awake. You can go a little longer if you're sleeping, obviously, but not too much longer. Your brain will essentially not have enough caloric energy to function. And what happens then is sort of like what happens to your phone or your tablet or your laptop when it's on low battery mode, which is it goes into power saving functions, and it shuts some things off and it slows some things down, and the screen gets a little dimmer. The same thing happens to your brain. So some experiences of anhedonia may be a resource depletion from not getting enough sleep, not getting enough physical activity, or not getting enough nutrition. And we talked about it a little bit already, but substance use can be implicated here as well. It can produce that short-term burst or peak, but then you're going to have a withdrawal effect from it. So we really want to try to keep things kind of even keel. And when I say substance use, I don't just mean like hard drugs. I obviously do mean hard drugs, but I really want you guys to be careful with things like marijuana, alcohol, even caffeine. Our brains, I'm speaking only for myself right now, but I'm also speaking for a lot of you, probably by default. Our brains are fragile. They react more strongly to a lot of things than most people's brains do. And so we have to be really careful about this. We have to be really careful about what we put in, and we have to be really careful about quantity. We have to be really careful about timing. Just treat your brain well, because I think that it deserves that. Okay, 3 additional treatments I want to cover, and these are sort of not complementary and alternative necessarily, because these are legit treatments. These are probably more along the lines of like last resorts if therapy and medication alone aren't getting the job done for you. ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, is a legitimate treatment option for many things, including anhedonia. ECT, I know, sounds scary, and I'm not going to tell you that it isn't. What I will say is that if you've seen it depicted in like a movie or something like that, which is probably a horror movie, it's always like the horror movie insane asylum, stereotypical like person like having a seizure on the bed. That's how it was like 60 years ago. ECT is much different now. It's much gentler, it's much milder, and it is something that can legitimately help here. If you've heard about ECT and you've heard about the side effect of pretty significant short-term memory loss being common, that is typical. Many people do experience that, so just something to be aware of. A typically better tolerated but similar treatment technique is what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. This works very similar to ECT, but instead of electricity, we're using magnets to modify brain functioning. It is typically a little bit more well tolerated and a little bit less prone to side effects. The third option worth considering, and one that's growing in popularity tremendously, is ketamine. Ketamine is an anesthetic, ironically enough, an anesthetic to treat an emotional anesthetic. I know that seems weird. I don't completely understand the physiology behind it. From what I've read, ketamine produces these protein spikes, this brain growth. It doesn't undo the effects of anhedonia, but it creates what would be the word? Antagonistic brain growth, to where parts of your brain that are more able to experience reward and joy and pleasure actually tend to grow at a faster rate. And so it simulates this brain development that helps counteract the effects of anhedonia. I'm speaking a little above my pay grade on that because I'm not a researcher. But that's my general understanding of how that works. So that's sort of the overview of the treatments, the professional treatments that are out there that we already know about. Moving on to our third section, my personal strategies for coping with anhedonia. I have 5 of these I'm going to review with you guys today. Actually 6. One's kind of a cheat code at the end. The first is what I call checking the lock. What I mean by this is when we're experiencing anhedonia, as we talked about before, when nothing feels good, you stop doing anything because it feels like a ripoff, basically. Like I'm putting energy in to, going to the gym or being social or going to work. Like I am still exerting effort, but I am getting nothing back in return. So life suddenly kind of takes on this feeling of like, I'm going to work, but I'm not getting paid anymore. And so it's very natural that when we see that we're kind of getting a raw deal and we're putting in, but we're not able to withdraw, we stop doing the thing because nobody likes to work for free. And the thing about that is it can put you in what I call a false depression, which is at some point this anhedonia is going to lift, but you won't automatically notice that. You won't necessarily just wake up one day and have the sun shining on your face and hear the birds singing and be like, oh my gosh, it's gone. It's not like being physically sick. Like when you have the flu or whatever, you just wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, I don't have the flu anymore. That's awesome. Anhedonia doesn't work that way because you're only going to notice your ability to experience joy when you do something that can produce joy. And if you have stopped doing those things, you might go long periods of time with the ability to enjoy things in your life and not realize that it's back. So checking the lock, I'm going kind of back to that prison metaphor here, basically means every day of your anhedonia, I want you to try at least one thing that you think should, under normal circumstances, bring you joy. Don't ever go an entire day without running at least one experiment. And within that, going back to these ideas of like partial and total anhedonia, make sure you try different things because you might assume I'm in an episode of total anhedonia. I can't feel anything. Excuse me. And you might find actually there are a few things that are still breaking through, but you're not going to know that if you don't try a bunch of different things. So, okay, video games aren't feeling good anymore. Gym's not feeling good anymore. Movies aren't feeling good anymore, but maybe I can still enjoy reading. But I wouldn't know that if after trying video games, movies in the gym, if I said, well, it's gone, can't experience anything. And I just didn't try anything else. I know it's frustrating. I know it's hard, but don't forget to check the lock every day because you never know when you're going to wake up and the prison guard has forgotten to lock you in. It will happen someday. Keep checking. 1 second. Okay. My second strategy, this one's a lot harder. The first one's hard. This one's way harder, is what I call scaffolding. And I think of this as like sometimes violence is the answer. What I mean by this is we all have what's called a dopamine threshold. It's not a physical thing in your brain. It's a concept. But something has to be good enough to register with your brain as good for your brain to release the dopamine. What I mean by that is like, obviously, good things happen to you every day that you don't notice. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my voice all of a sudden. I really hope I'm not getting sick. Wouldn't that be ironic when I was just talking about getting sick? Okay, so you have this dopamine threshold in your brain. which basically means things have to feel good enough for your brain to register it as good for you to feel anything. When you're driving and you stop at a stop sign or you stop at a red light, that's technically a good thing, right? Like that's a good thing that happened and it's better than not stopping at one. But you probably don't experience joy or achievement when you stop at a stop sign. Your brain's probably not like, yes, we did it. Let's go, boys. It's normal, right? Like nothing happens from that. So that's below your dopamine threshold. What I think happens sometimes with anhedonia is it's not that the dopamine is gone, it's that the threshold just gets raised a lot. And sometimes if you just overload your system with like one enjoyable thing after the other, it's like stacking boxes. So the prison cell is still locked, but there's a window 15 feet up, right? If I stack all these empty boxes and reach that window, maybe that's the way I can get out of prison. So on days when you have the ability to just throw a bunch of stuff in a blender basically and see what comes out, sometimes you can still cross that threshold. It just takes tremendous energy to do so. A similar strategy, but a slight variation here, is overloading your brain with different types of positive emotions. Usually, during a period of anhedonia, the emotional absence that we notice the most is joy. And what we often do, because we notice the absence of joy the most strongly, is joy is the emotion we chase the most. So we engage in activity after activity after activity that we think should bring us joy, and we get more and more frustrated when we are not experiencing that joy. I have gotten a lot of mileage out of not just chasing joy specifically, but of kind of barraging my brain with a mix of a lot of different pleasant emotions, not just necessarily joy. It's kind of like a recipe, like throw a little joy in there, but also a little achievement, maybe a little relaxation, maybe a little connection, maybe a little excitement. When you have a lot of different pleasant emotions hitting your brain all at once, I think sometimes that works better than just going all in on joy. Because if the joy is just not there, and sometimes it's not, sometimes you can find it somewhere else. I've noticed a couple people saying they missed part of this. It's going to be uploaded after, so don't worry, you can watch the whole thing. Fourth strategy that I use is what's called loopholes. Like we said before, especially with that partial anhedonia, sometimes it doesn't get everything. Sometimes you can find the one or two areas of your life that still kind of break through and that you can still experience joy through. So try a lot of different things, like try a different food every day, try a different hobby every day, talk to different people. Don't just try one or two things and assume it is all gone. I was going to say, I don't know why. I have a suspicion. Usually when I'm feeling a lot of anhedonia, I lose interest in a lot of food, but there's one food that almost always still can break through for me, and that is a burger from a charcoal grill. Like, as simple as that may be, there's a lot of nostalgia value in that for me. And I think, that dopamine threshold gets raised really high, but there's so much in charcoal burgers for me. It may or may not sound silly, but if you knew my life, you'd understand that that's one that just gets me. And so that almost always works for me. Not always. Sometimes it's like literally zero. But keep looking for the loopholes, because sometimes there is a certain part of your life that is just either untouched or less disrupted by the anhedonia. Fifth strategy is what I call investments. And this is essentially like saving your experiences for later. So something that's interesting is the emotions that we experience during a period of our lives, like you do something and it feels some certain way while you're doing it, right, is not necessarily the emotion that you will experience when you're recalling the memory of doing that thing later. So a really good example is, I'm sure probably every single person watching this has at least one relationship that was really good and it ended badly. And even though your times with that person were happy, when you look back on those times now, they have kind of become sad memories because of the way it ended, right? That can work the other way around too, though. That doesn't only go in the negative direction. There are a lot of things that I have done in my life during times of anhedonia that I didn't enjoy while I did them, but I did them anyway. And when I look back on them, when I recall those memories or look at pictures of them or like replay them in my head like a video, I can experience joy from them now because I'm not in a state of anhedonia, even though at the time I did not experience joy. So it's not a waste to do things like, let's say that you had something exciting planned. Maybe you were going to go to like a concert or go on a vacation or something like that. And you hit a really rough patch in life. You hit a deep depressive episode and you think, I'm not even going to bother to go. Like, I'm not going to enjoy this. So why would I bother to go? I would encourage you to consider still going, because you may look back on that. Even if you go and you feel nothing, you will almost certainly look back on that experience later and experience some of the emotions that you should have experienced while you were there had you not been in a period of anhedonia. We have this system in our brains called mood congruent memory, which means we tend to recall memories that are similar to the emotional state we are in at the time. So when you're angry, you think of a bunch of other things that made you angry. When you're sad, you think of a lot of other sad memories. When you're happy, you think a lot of the happy memories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you're recalling these memories later, they can have a different emotional component than what they did during the experience. Hopefully that makes sense. And the last strategy, this is the desperate last ditch attempt. And this isn't even really a strategy, it's more of a philosophy. If all else fails, that's when I go to my strategy that I call apathyception. If nothing I do can make me care about anything, the ace up my sleeve is, why do I have to care about anything? It's sort of like I wish I could articulate exactly how I do it, like physiologically, because I don't know how to explain it. But sometimes for a period of time, we just need to accept that we don't care. And if we've done everything in our power to try to, it's not literally we don't care, like it doesn't matter to me. It's I don't care as in I'm not experiencing any emotion from this right now. You can still do things even if you don't care about doing them. It's just way harder, but it's not impossible. And if you accept that, like, okay, today I'm not going to feel any joy, if you accept that that's gone, then you're still left with a choice. So with my job, for example, so if I go to work, I own this business. So if I don't come here, I don't make any money. I don't have a salary. I only get paid for what I do. So if I'm in a period of anhedonia, I can either go to work and not enjoy going to work, but make money, or I can not go to work and not enjoy not being at work and make no money. So there's three variables there. Do I enjoy myself? Do I go to work? And do I make money? If two of them don't change and only one of them does, and the one that changes is, do I make money? I would still rather make money than not make money, even if I'm horribly depressed. I would still rather work out than not work out, even if I don't care about working out. But you have to be able to accept, like, nothing I do right now, right this very second, is going to produce that. Because then if you know that's not an option, then your brain focuses on, well, what's the next difference in this decision pathway? And you're going to find something that still turns out better if you do the thing that you would normally do because it feels good or because it feels rewarding, even if that's not the reason you do it in the moment. So that is what I call apathyception. And that's my last ditch attempt. It's my least favorite one because it's basically just like accepting that life's kind of going to suck for a little bit, but sometimes it does. Sometimes it does, and there's nothing you can do about it. So we have about 20 minutes left. There are a couple questions I wrote down ahead of time because some people submitted questions before. I tried to just kind of tie in a lot of the questions you guys had into my presentation. There's a couple I'm going to address separately, and then this would also be the time for people to start putting some questions in the chat, and I'll try to get those as well. Two that stood out to me, though, from the questions you guys submitted, who signed up in advance for this. One was, how do I get back into life after a period of anhedonia? And this is an excellent question because it's not as easy as it might seem. I know it might seem like, well, once I start feeling good, I'll just automatically start doing everything again. And if it was like a week, that's probably true. But if you're coming out of, like, let's say a 2 or 3 year period of anhedonia, you've lost your habits, you've lost your routines, you've lost your momentum. You're not going to just automatically pick those things back up again. Now, it's not going to be as hard as it was to establish them in the first place. It's never as hard to reactivate a habit as it was to form it in the first place. But the longer you go without being engaged in that habit, the harder it is to restart it. So if you're coming back from a long period of anhedonia, I do suggest taking a stepwise approach. Pick one thing, work on integrating that back into your life. And once that feels fairly natural to you, it's not taking a tremendous amount of effort to do that thing, then add one more thing back and just keep going kind of one after the other. Don't put any time expectations on it because no one knows how long this stuff is going to take. That's what drives me nuts. Okay, there's going to be like a 1-minute mini rant, tangential rant. As a therapist, I often fill out disability paperwork for people, obviously for their mental health. And if you guys have ever seen that disability paperwork, it's 100% geared towards physical health conditions because they ask like, how long will this person have this condition? I don't know. How long will this person be depressed? It doesn't adhere to a timeline. Like no one knows. I'm a psychologist, not a psychic. It's a ridiculous question. So don't put timelines on yourself. There's no reason to do that. No one knows how long this is going to take. Just do your best and see how long it takes. And once it feels easy, go on to the next thing. Don't rush yourself though, because when you try to change too much too soon, it's like stepping on footing that isn't solid yet, and the whole thing can crumble. The second question I really wanted to address: why do I resist feeling good? This is something I see all the time, and I think that there are two separate reasons for this. Maybe there's more, but I've definitely seen at least two distinct reasons for this. The first is we get used to not feeling good. And whatever you're used to, even if you hate it, there is a certain level of comfort that goes along with it. And to me, this is no different than like you probably know someone who's in a bad marriage and they complain about their partner constantly and they're clearly not happy, but they stay in the marriage. Or maybe you know someone who hates where they live. They don't like the city, they don't like the house, maybe they don't even like the country they live in, but they still live there. Because you get used to things, and even if you don't like them, sometimes the pain of sticking with something that you don't like but are very familiar with and like generally know how to deal with and know how to navigate sometimes seems preferable to the challenge of trying something new. So I think that's the first reason. And I think the second reason is that feeling better is scary. Because when you know that you're on the bottom, when you know like there's just nothing, like this is as low as I can go and it can't get any worse, there's kind of comfort in that. Like you know that you're not going to wake up tomorrow feeling twice as bad as you did today because you feel as bad as a person can feel. And it's kind of like if you've been single for a long time and you enter into a relationship. Like, yes, that's a good thing. That's exciting. That's fun. It's also terrifying. Because for the first time in a long time, you suddenly have something to lose. And that's not a good feeling. That's a very, very scary feeling. It's like you basically kind of trade your depression for anxiety. And they're both very challenging to deal with in their own ways. Getting better is scary. Getting better is risky. Getting better can be terrifying because sometimes the only thing that feels worse than being at the bottom is falling, and you can't fall if you're already at the bottom. And I think this is probably also why some people self-sabotage, because getting your hopes up and getting excited about things and potentially having something to lose feels a lot scarier than the sameness and the grayness and the bland nothingness of life being exactly the same every day. All right, I'm going to turn to the chat questions now. Let's see. There are a lot of them. So I'm just going to kind of sporadically pick a couple so that I don't spend the next 5 minutes reading them. If mood can affect our memories, can forcing yourself to think about happy memories trick your mind into thinking you actually are happy? Whoa. That's a really good question. There's so much in that. So in general, I would say that the answer so I'm not, okay. I just want to check. I'm not SpongeBob, right? I must not be. You guys would have told me by now. The memory, basically whatever's in your consciousness at any given moment has an effect on your emotions. So this goes back to thoughts and memories, thoughts and emotions, which can be related to memories, having a reciprocal relationship with each other. And so trying to recall positive memories I would consider that to be a form of mindfulness. Mindfulness is the conscious direction of your attention, because your attention includes memories. You have millions of memories in your brain. You obviously aren't thinking about all of them simultaneously, and some will randomly pop in from time to time, usually because there was some sort of trigger. Like there was something in my external environment that reminded me of something in my past. Boom, there's a memory. So your brain will automatically give you memories, or not give you memories, help you recall memories. But you, of course, do have the ability to consciously choose a memory and recall it. And doing so is a form of mindfulness, because you're choosing one of many options to pay attention to, rather than just letting your brain pick your attention for you. And that absolutely can change your emotional state. The part of your question that really gave me pause, though, is you described that as tricking yourself into thinking that you are happy. I would actually say that that is just a form of being happy. It's not anymore of like this is one of those things our brains do. Okay. So if you think about a happy memory and it makes you feel happy, we call that a trick. We say, oh, I've tricked myself into being happy. But how is that any more of a trick than if you're having a decent day and suddenly your brain pulls up a bad memory, like a breakup or a death or something, and now you feel sad? Have you tricked yourself into being sad? No, you're just sad. That's not a fake feeling. Just because it's about a memory and not something that's happening right this very second, that's a real feeling. But we have this tendency to treat our sadness as real and our happiness as fake. And I think it comes from, like, which is more common. If you spend 90% of your life not feeling great, then the moments where you do feel good feel artificial, because there's such a dramatic departure from your norm. But happiness is not less real than sadness. Every emotion, at the risk of sounding a little hippie-ish, every emotion is real. I don't believe there is such a thing as a fake emotion. Now, I know I talked a couple weeks ago in my video about toxic behavior. Like, you can have emotions for, or at least I'm only going to talk about myself, because I would never say this to someone else. I can have emotions for stupid reasons. The emotion is still a real thing, but the reason is not always legit, But that doesn't make the emotion fake. So if you conjure up a happy memory and you experience some amount of joy as a result of engaging with that memory, I would not say that you have tricked yourself into being happy. I would say you have, in that moment, increased your happiness. That's effective. So that's absolutely a strategy that I would encourage you to use. Another question I saw come up here: how can you stop negative memories? This is going to sound really pessimistic, but I'm going to expand. The short answer is you can't, because you can't micromanage your own brain. You have memories of sadness and anger and betrayal and hurt and all these other things. You can't stop them. There's no way to get rid of them. But what you can do is, when you realize you've had one, there is a trick you can use. Let me just remove this confidential information from this piece of paper here. So this is actually another mindfulness strategy. It's just sort of this other side of the same coin. Your capacity for attention is limited. You can only pay attention to like a finite amount of stimuli at any given moment in your life. So right now, you guys, hopefully, if I'm doing a good job, are paying attention to me on whatever device you're on. But there's tons of other stuff happening around you, even if you're sitting alone in a dark room. There's objects and shapes and colors and sounds and smells, and like you have memories in your brain. There's tons of stimuli, and it's all hitting you subconsciously, and then your brain is like basically bottlenecking it and only sending a few parts of what you're taking in to your consciousness. So you're only processing a little bit of this huge amount of stimuli. Because you only process a little bit, and because your brain has a limited capacity for attention, you can get things out of your consciousness by putting other things in it. So let's say that at this moment, you are watching, let's pretend you're watching my presentation. That sounds weird because you are, but you know what I mean. Let's say that as you're watching this presentation, you get hit with a trauma memory. And it's a strong trauma memory. And so if this pie chart that I'm drawing here, this represents your consciousness, your attention, Like 80% of it somehow is your trauma memory. So you just got completely blindsided and overwhelmed by this very difficult emotion, right? As you're watching this presentation, if you simultaneously, this is going to sound kind of cheesy, but bear with me. If you add some additional stimuli to your consciousness, like let's say you go light a candle or plug in a wall plug-in or something to add some scent stimuli. And then in addition to watching my presentation, on a second device next to it, you pull up a cat video. Look what happens to your attention. The trauma memory still exists, but you notice it is now taking up less space in your brain because we put other things in there. And that's actually the best way to get something out of your mind. There's no direct way to do it, but there is an indirect way to do it. Put other things in because it has a limited storage capacity. So the more either pleasant or even just neutral stimuli that you add, the more you have going on in there, the less space your brain has to engage with the trauma memory. I've explained this before. Those of you who either have or have had or worked with small kids, it's a lot like dealing with little kids, because little kids have a pretty consistent amount of energy throughout the day, right? Unless they're sick or something like that. And usually that amount is high. Most young children have lots of energy. And so they are wanting to do something, right? They typically want to be pretty active throughout the day. If you don't give young children activities to do, they will find their own activities, but they may not be activities you want them to do. That's when you don't give kids anything to do, that's when you find them coloring on the walls or jumping off of couches or looking up stuff they shouldn't be on the internet or whatever. They get into trouble because they didn't have a place to direct their attention to. So things just kind of got chosen for them. The best way, in my opinion, as a parent, the best way to keep your kids out of trouble isn't to tell them not to do these things. It's to give them other things to do. If you keep them occupied with activities that you approve of, they just don't have time or energy to do this other stuff you don't want them to do. Like I can tell my kids, don't do X, Y, Z. If they get bored enough, they will. But if I give them other stuff to do, they won't get bored enough to do the thing. So basically treat the subconscious to conscious translation process as like watching a little kid. Give your brain stuff to do so that it doesn't get itself into trouble. I saw someone ask how this correlates with meditation. Here's my disclaimer on this. I am far from a meditation expert. There are tools that I feel like I'm pretty strong at, and there's ones that I'm not. I would put meditation in the category of, I don't feel particularly knowledgeable on meditation. I will say for me, who does struggle with a lot of intrusive thoughts and things like that, the stereotypical, like, clear your mind meditation has not gone well for me. And in fact, does often result in my brain wandering to places that I do not wish for it to be. However, when I do like a guided meditation, when rather than trying to empty my mind, if I try to focus my mind fully on one thing, then that actually uses this same principle. So if I put on, like, I'm from northern Minnesota, so I love loons, if you guys know what loons sound like. If I put on like loon calls with peaceful music, and I just try to focus all of my energy, I know I explained this already, but I'm just going to redraw the same graph. Let's say that I'm having an intrusive thought about worthlessness. I'm just going about my day, handling my business, and all of a sudden my brain goes, hey, guess what? You're worthless. And suddenly I'm like, oh, crap. And I just get like, I can't, sometimes my defenses are up and I can just boom, and then sometimes not. Sometimes it gets in and I engage with it accidentally before I even realize it. And so then it looks like this. I'm just completely overcome with the intrusive thought. So if I do a guided meditation, then maybe it looks a little bit like this. Now there's loons in my brain too, and that's an improvement. I'd rather have loons in my brain than thoughts of failure and worthlessness. So it's all about directing your attention to things that are either enjoyable and pleasant, or, at worst, just non-threatening, non-negative. I do not appreciate the comments about Minnesota and their Super Bowl history. Please keep those to you. Just kidding. But yeah, it was not a great, well, it was a great year almost, but then not at the end. Anyway, moving on. I'm going to try to do one more. I got about 5 minutes left here. Scott, what are your thoughts on eye movement something to I love the way this is phrased. Scott, what are your thoughts on eye movement something to process crap from front brain to back because it is blocked? I'm not making fun of you, Sharon. I love the way you said that. I'm assuming what you're referring to there is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR. I don't believe that EMDR is really considered to be an anhedonia treatment at this point. It's kind of like DBT. It was developed for one thing, and now they're using it for other things. The main thing I've seen EMDR used for is traumas, PTSD. And so EMDR is a form of exposure therapy. And while you're doing, there's a few ways you can do it. The main principle is bilateral stimulation. So sometimes that means you're like, I hit the finger and I didn't follow it. Yeah, you have to follow the finger. It doesn't work. You move something from side to side, or you use like these buzzers, and you're following this visual stimuli while you're processing or recalling the trauma memory. And apparently a combination of the trauma exposure with the bilateral stimulation supposedly helps your brain reprocess that memory from a more neutral, grounded, resourced, and safe place. And the data, like in terms of scientific outcomes, is pretty legit. Like EMDR seems to work really well for a lot of people. There are a handful of people, by the way, though, who respond really poorly to it, meaning not just it doesn't work, like it makes them worse and screws them up. So just keep that in mind. The thing about EMDR, most people don't question or criticize whether it works. There is some controversy around EMDR, and the controversy is, does the bilateral stimulation part do anything? Because while you're doing the bilateral stimulation, you're either thinking about or talking about a trauma memory, which is exposure therapy. And we already know that exposure therapy works for trauma. That's not new. We've known that for like 50 years. So EMDR beats placebo, which means it's a real treatment. It works better than just telling someone they're being treated and like making them watch cat videos or something. Actually, cat videos would be a bad placebo because that would actually make people happy, but some kind of neutral stimuli. I distracted myself because now I'm thinking about cat videos. Remember the pie chart? My brain just went to cats. So EMDR, the controversy is that when you look at studies that compare EMDR not to a placebo, but to exposure therapy, most studies don't see a difference there, which leads some people, I'm still kind of on the fence where I land on this personally, leads some people to believe that EMDR is just fancy exposure therapy. And the reason it can look that way is it really, honestly, if you're the client in a therapy session, it works well. So you don't necessarily need to worry about this. It's more clinicians that I worry about, because EMDR is really expensive to get trained in. Like there's a company, it's called EMDRIA, and I don't remember what the International Association, I think. Like, it's a business. EMDR is literally a business, and they make a crap load of money training people on how to do EMDR. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, therapists having more tools is good. I'm not against that. It's just that the training is really expensive. And so some people think that the bilateral stimulation component of EMDR is a marketing gimmick, which it may be. I mean, everything's an industry now, right? And sad as it may be, mental health is an industry. People make money off of it. And so I'm sure that some people in my field are trying to maximize profits, and that may or may not include members of, I think you say it, I think it's EMDRIA. I think you don't actually say every individual letter the way that I did. I'm sure there's probably people in an organization who fall into that category, but that doesn't mean it's a bad treatment. Yes, DBT, someone mentioned DBT. That's kind of a similar, and I think IFS is kind of, and I have a provider here who does IFS, so I'm not bad mouthing it at all. But man, our IFS training is expensive, internal family systems. That's a whole other topic for another day, though. I am about out of time here because I do have one more client to see yet today. So I am going to let you guys go for now. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for your questions. As I said, this will be uploaded to the channel, so this was not like a one-time only deal. I also want to say a special thanks to, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Callitz Bill. I don't know if I said that right. Looks like he gifted some people some channel memberships. I literally didn't even know you could do that. So that's very cool of you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, guys. See you soon. I'll have another new video up on Monday as per usual. So, and we'll do more lives. These are fun. I really enjoy them. So you'll see me again before too long. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend. Bye.